you.
Yeah, that's recording now.
All right, thank you. Okay, hi everyone. Okay, thank you so much for being here. So David was very kind and he just came in. So this is an in-person talk. So the title of his talk is Book Owners Online. And I think I'm just going to stop here and just leave it up to you.
Okay, thank you. Yes, so I can see me on your screen, so I hope that all the Zoom folks can see me, and I'm assuming everybody can see my PowerPoint, so that is good. So thank you everybody for being here either in person or virtually. And what I want to do is talk about this online database, Book Owners Online, which I created and which is hosted here at UCL. And I have a link with DIS here. I mean, since I retired, I have been an honorary senior research associate, I think is my title at DIS. So I'm delighted to have the opportunity to actually come here and talk a bit about some of the things that I have been up to. And so I want to talk about this database which I created, which is something to facilitate research and study and discovery around book history, historical bibliography, that kind of area. And what I propose to do is try to explain what it is and how it works and why I created it and where we're trying to go with it, and then think a bit about some of the challenges around its ongoing development. So I hope that it will be of some interest to, in a digital humanities sense, generally as a digital humanities project, quite apart from anything to do with its content and what you can find out from it.
So just before we get started, David, we can see the slides in like presenter mode. So the main one and the next one that's about to be shown. I don't know if you want to make it full screen. Might be a bit small for.
Yeah. There we are. Okay.
Yeah, that's
right. I am delighted to say I'm not in charge of the technology in this. I'm here to do what I'm told and admire what you can make to work. So what it is, Book Owners Online, it is, I hope what it says on the tin, it is a freely available online database about historic book owners. It contains a lot of data, a lot of information, entries about people who owned private libraries, historical book ownership, principally British book owners between the 16th and the 18th centuries. That's the main focus of where it is at the moment, although it does have scope to be expanded further if and when we can resource that. And it currently has about 3,000, just under 3,000 entries in it for individuals who owned books. And the database is built around a spine of names, a spine of people who were the book owners. And there is a simple alphabetical list of them all. And a typical entry in the database looks something like this. It's a database, it has a field structure, obviously, and a standard entry has a brief biographical section which tells you something about who the person was and key basic facts about them, but not a detailed biography. It has a section headed Books, which aims to describe what we know, what we can say about the books that that person owned, what kind of library they had, what kind of thing might have been in it, what happened to their library, if we can know that. The content of that field varies a lot from entry to entry, depending on what kind of information we have got. And some of them are quite short and some of them are quite long. I mean, it's entirely free text kind of construct. And we have a field called characteristic markings, where, if possible, we describe briefly the ways in which that person typically marked their books, because one of the purposes, one of the uses of this database is to enable people, whether they're curators or collectors or dealers or whoever, who have got some kind of evidence in a book in front of them. I've got this name, is it such and such? Is it this particular person? And so having descriptions and ideally images like book plates and inscriptions in these entries is helpful in that kind of context. And then we've got a field headed sources, which is bibliographical references to tell you where to go next. And Book Owners Online is not intended to be the last word on its subject. Its aim is to be rather the first word, or the first place to go. What it would like to be is the place that people automatically gravitate to if they've got this kind of question. And the entry will tell you some essential facts and give you signposts as to where to go from here. And in some cases, there are lots of signposts because some of the names that are in this database are very well known and very well documented people. And in some cases, it's much shorter and simpler. So this is a case where we've got an early 18th century woman book owner who had a book plate, who had a library. We know something about her book, so you can say a bit more. And there are a number of sources that you can point people out to. But some of the entries are much shorter because all we know is that there was a person whose books were sold at a book sale in 1727 or whatever. And that's as much as we know because we haven't been able to trace any of those books. We don't know anything about what happened to them, but we do know that this person owned a library, and so they get an entry in the database. And each record is flagged with a series of categories, essentially subject headings to facilitate interrogation. So, you can easily find out, how many gardeners there are in the database, how many businessmen, how many judges and lawyers, how many libraries that were sold at auction, how many libraries were sold by fixed price sale, etc., etc. So there is this structure of categories to facilitate that sort of interrogation, but obviously you can search the database on a basis and discover stuff that way. The underlying software of the database is Semantic Media Wiki. So it sits on a wiki type platform, and it is hosted here at UCL through the Centre for Editing Lives and Letters, although it's also sponsored by the Bibliographical Society, which is an independent learned society, focusing on book history. And so it's an e-publication of the Bibliographical Society, hosted here with memoranda between the two, and I put content in. I mean, that's the sort of platform, the kind of underpinning arrangements through which it's hosted. We have a Facebook page, which we created a few years ago in order to facilitate informal discussion, to encourage people to engage with the project, to create a space where people can post queries, any or all of those kinds of things. The database was first launched in 2020, at which point it focused only on 17th century English owners, and we have expanded it since to get to the just under 3,000 that we've now got. but we've got a long way to go to get it to where ideally we would like it to be in terms of content. And I realize that Facebook is now just so, what are you doing, showing us, showing us. Well, okay, I freely admit that. Whether there would be value in creating a TikTok page or a project like this, I would value your thoughts, your advice on that. Why did I do this? Why did I create this thing in what is does look a bit of a niche area of humanities research? I think the fundamental answer is because there has been so much interest, growing interest in recent decades in looking at historic books through the lens of the ways that they've been owned and bound and read and all of those kinds of things. Provenance research, where books have been, has become a significant growth area in what we used to call historical bibliography, and I think we now call book history. And lots of people are paying it a lot more attention. Librarians now systematically record the former ownership of their books in their library catalogues. Researchers want to know about it. Collectors desire it. Any antiquarian book dealer will tell you that provenance helps to sell books nowadays in a way that 50 or so years ago was not the case. 50, 100 years ago, people tended to want clean, unmarked books that, any kind of intervention evidence, like the things on this screen, there were kind of defacements. And that mindset on the academic side, the collecting side, the dealing side, all of those kinds of things has changed hugely. And I'm sure Tabitha, who I know is out here somewhere, would agree with that. She'll confirm it. If you doubt me, ask Tabitha. There is just so much more activity and interest. And I think there is more interest because of the way that our interest in historic books has evolved over that time period. We used to be interested in historic books because we wanted to record the authors and the titles, and we wanted to know what books had been published, and we wanted to be able to establish the canonical text of Hamlet, and all of those kinds of rationales behind studying old books. And in the 20th century, there was a huge amount of work went into enumerative bibliography, making lists, wanting to know everything that was published and survives. And there were big short title catalogue projects, and we've got a body of knowledge now around what was published and what survives, which 100 years ago we didn't have. I mean, if 100 years ago, if you wanted to know how many editions of a certain work there were and where they all were, you had a big uphill job to do. And today we've got tools that we take for granted. We've got we've got ESTC, if and when we can ever access it again at the British Library. We've got ISTC, we've got USTC, we've got a whole host of bibliographical tools that create a sort of research infrastructure, a bedrock that, as I say, we now take for granted and you can build a lot of work on. And this sort of field, provenance studies, ownership, knowing more about the people who actually owned the things and what they did with them, that is, it's kind of in the state that the listing stuff was 100 years ago, I think. We've become a lot more interested, but the research infrastructure has not been fully built. And there are various other online sources out there which people have established. There are big databases relating to provenance around particular kinds of books, particularly 15th century books where a lot of work's been done. So material evidence in Incunabula, they've got a special database on owners, but that's only of 15th century books. There are other projects in this sort of space, like annotated books online, building a database of books that are interestingly and very extensively annotated, and creating digital facsimiles of those. We've recently, there was a new big database project launched on borrowing registers for early modern libraries, and you can see there's a relation there between ownership and private libraries and you borrowing books from libraries, but it's something different. There is a reading experience database, which now has a rather old and clunky interface, which seeks to capture references to books that have got lots of evidence of having been read in them. But all of these things, although they're in a related space, they're not quite in the space that Book Owners Online occupies. And the thing about Book Owners Online is that it starts with the owners. It doesn't start with a particular library or a particular collection of books. And, you know, here are the names that we happen to find in these books. It starts by saying, let's build a spine of names of people who we know owned stuff, had libraries. There are books of theirs out there that we might want to know more about. And let's build around that. And that rationale of Book Owners Online is what is distinctive and special about it, I think. And so I created it because I thought it needed to exist, because I think research, if we're more interested in provenance, research needs research infrastructure. It needs those kinds of bedrocks to go to help you to do your research, whatever avenue that might be taking. And there was nothing quite like Book Owners Online out there. And I think we need it. You know, I feel that our knowledge of this book historical landscape, you know, it reminds me a bit of those early modern maps that you sometimes see of Africa or America, where, you know, in the 18th century, they compiled maps where the overall outline of the continent was known. And, you know, they knew what was sort of the first 30 miles inland, and then the interior of the continent is just got great. And it feels to me that our knowledge base in this kind of historic book owners area, you know, it's a bit like that now. It's where the bibliographical listing knowledge was 100 years ago, and that map has now been all filled in. So, you know, there's an awful long way to go, but you've got to start by, you know, mapping out the outlines and then working inwards from there. And that's what we are trying to do. How do we select entries to put into this database? You know, how are all those names selected? Well, there are a number of standard places where you can go to start building that spine. There are lots of people through history who have used book plates or armorial binding stamps, and there are directories of those things which you can quarry in order to help build that list of names. Huge numbers of libraries over the last few centuries have been sold by auction or by retail sale, and there are lots of sale catalogues that survive for those libraries, or references to sales in early newspapers. So we may not have the books themselves or know where they went to, but we know that so-and-so had a library of 1,000 books, 3,000 books, whatever, because here is a record of that library which went through the sale room in 1700 or whatever. So there's a lot of data to be gleaned from there. People sometimes left lists of their books in their wills or in their probate documents. There are lots of lists of early book ownership in probate inventories. So that's another quarry that we can go to. There are surviving collections of books in various libraries. And so where you know you've got 100 books that came from the same place in UCL Library or the British Library or wherever, you know, you've got somebody who obviously ought to be added there. And occasionally there are slightly quirkier kinds of bits of evidence, like early images of people with books. So the chap on the screen here, looking a bit fed up, is the Dean of Canterbury in the 1620s, sitting in his study. It says at the top, Conciliari Mei, in my study. And you can see he's there sitting surrounded by what must have been his books. And we don't know where any of them are now, but clearly this is somebody who did own books. So there are lots of bits of evidence to help us to build that spine. And there's no shortage of further data that needs to be input, you know, just to get us to the end of the desirable list that you would create by working through those various sources. The only entry so far in the database for somebody who didn't own any books is Shakespeare, because I did create an entry for Shakespeare because you know, he is somebody whose books researchers regularly seek for, and it is well known by Shakespeare scholars that despite endless searching, no book owned by Shakespeare can be found today that definitely belong to him. There are plenty of books out there with 16th century hand-looking signatures, William Shakespeare on the title page, and they're all forgeries. You know, it's you know, finding a book that Shakespeare owned, because Shakespeare clearly did read books, and it seems very likely that he owned books. I mean, unless Shakespeare really was Bacon or the Earl of Oxford or whatever, but I'm assuming we don't subscribe to that slightly eccentric view. And so, you know, I did think an entry needed to be there for Shakespeare, but that is the only one for somebody who we know actually didn't own any. How have we built this thing? I mean, how's it been done? Well, it started with a body of data that I put together over many years as part of various research projects, which sort of created the building block for the 17th century entries. And the Bibliographical Society agreed to take it on as an e-publication. It put a little bit of money in the pot back in 2019, which enabled us to hire a part-time editorial assistant who worked here in the Cell office for a year or so, who input a lot of the first body of data and helped us to design the thing and work out the basic first template of it. Since then, I've had a couple of three other small grants from Bodleian London, from the Mark Fitch Fund, and from a private donor in Scotland to employ further sort of doctoral level, postdoc kind of level editorial assistants. And they have enabled a lot of building of the database by doing dedicated inputting and research. But crowdsourcing is also an important part of this thing, has always been envisaged as an important part of it. And we do have a small but growing team of volunteer editors who are people who are supportive, are interested, are knowledgeable, and can help. And because it's in a simple wiki format, you know, it's very easy to give anybody a login. And once you get your head around the wiki markup language, and we've got an editorial manual to help with that, then, you know, you sail away. So anybody here or out there, or any of your friends, you know, seriously, anybody who would be interested in joining this worthy band of volunteers, I would be delighted to hear from you. Because, as I say, that's an important part of the the building of this thing. And some of the best entries in the database, I think, are ones that have been created by volunteers, because part of the challenge here is that all around the place, there are lots of people who have got detailed, really useful knowledge about particular historic owners, because they've worked on their libraries, because they've done PhDs on it, because they've done projects on it, because they look after their libraries in historic libraries out there. And, you know, they've got a package of knowledge in their heads, which, if we could just get it distilled into this database, would be useful to other people. And encouraging people to do that is one of the tasks, one of the challenges, one of the things that one's constantly wanting to do. Because, I mean, there are a couple of entries on the screen here which were made for us by Cambridge College librarians who look after collections that include these people's books, and so they've got lots of really useful information. And the hard bit, obviously, and quite reasonably, is just harnessing those half hours of time from people to get them to input. And we do have input forms, online forms, templates that you can use to just, you know, sort of fill in the words, send it, and we'll put it up. Or people are welcome to become volunteers, whatever. I mean, any which way that the knowledge can be harnessed is what we want to do. So that's what it is, and that's where it's at. And I think it's not hard to see a number of challenges going forward. It's got about 3,000 entries in it at the moment. It's a long way off having the kind of critical mass of entries which really it needs to have before people will start regarding it as a default. Oh, you know, I mean, obviously, you know, we've got this going, book owners online, that's the place to go. You know, you go to ESTC, or you did when it was available, because, you know, you knew it was reliable. If you're looking for an English book printed before 1800, you want to know, does it exist and where will I find copies? You know that ESTC will tell you that information 90-odd% reliably. And this is a long way off being at that kind of point. Sustainability. Are you looking at your watch? And
No,
right, oh, no.
we'll have until 2.
Yeah.
Maybe leave some time for questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But, you know, shut me up if I'm talking too long. Sustainability is obviously one of the big challenges of all of these kinds of projects. And I mean, I'm sure you digital humanists will be well aware of that. You know, we all know of this, you know, the graveyard that awaits projects like this if they don't keep being refreshed and their platforms developed and all of those kinds of things. And I'm hoping that because it is on a wiki-based platform, it's, you know, it's not some strange bespoke piece of database software. It's on a platform which will be, you know, refreshable and should have a long life, but continuing to have access to some sort of development funding to keep it alive and keep refreshing it is obviously going to be important. Funding is very definitely a challenge. And it is much on my mind, you know, where to go from here to get the next serious grant to take it on to the next level, which is very clearly what it needs. We've got to where we're at with these, just as I say, just under 3,000 entries like this up there, with quite a small amount of money. It's been done with about £75,000 in grants. I've had a couple of grants of 25 and one of 15, and you know, and in this kind of world, it's peanuts. You know, it's nothing. You know, you talk to the UCL research office about, you know, you've had how much funding, you know, go away and don't waste my time. I understand that. And I have thought about the obvious avenues like, AHRC research projects. I've talked to the folks in Cell who, certainly would be interested, would be delighted if we could use this to land a decent AHRC project. But I think the problem is that so much of the funding in the academic sector is more interested in traditional academic research outputs than in research infrastructure. And that's what this is. This is a resource. There's no end of academic research projects which can flow out of it. But, the AHRC tends to think in terms of, well, what's the big monograph or monographs that will come out of your grant? And, well, if you have to make a database in order to facilitate that, well, okay, but, the database is kind of a bit ancillary. And, in all honesty, this is not like that. This is the research infrastructure. And, as a professional librarian by trade rather than an academic, it seems to me that that is a vastly more important bit of the landscape than the academic monograph, which is sort of 5 years down the line a fish and chip wrapper. But what's more important or useful, ESTC or the various projects that are research based on it? It seems to me that the resource is what you need, but it's hard to get funding for this kind of thing. So, I do have a few ideas. I asked Mellon and they said, no, we don't do that kind of thing anymore. But at some point I need to bring in a more serious bit of funding to hire a team of people to work on it and really build it. So, I can see what needs to be done. I think there are some interesting challenges or interesting questions about join up in this area digitally. I think one of the things that always bugs me is that there are multiple projects, digital projects out there right now, which do relate to this kind of world, but they're all doing something slightly different. So, there's a good and regularly refreshed blog site on early modern women book ownership. And, lots of data goes up there about female book ownership. There is a project under the wing of the Bookplate Society to create a big new directory of British book plates, which is something which anybody who works with book plates knows we very much need. There are various things like this that are beavering away, and if we could find a way of joining them up more, I think that would actually make a lot of sense. What we need are some silver bullets. So you type a name in that you're interested in, and it comes up with all the various places where you might find useful information. Or you create one thing that becomes a platform that serves them all. I don't know. The technology to do something like this clearly exists. And I always think that if the kind of information we deal with was useful to the Pentagon, then, it would exist. It would have existed, some time ago. But unfortunately, it's kind of a little niche, and its military value is decidedly limited. So as I say, the technology is there to do it. It's finding the funding and the resource to make it happen. But there are, it is quite a fragmented kind of landscape. But at the end of the day, I think it needs to be a community resource, a community-owned resource. I want to get it to the point where it is sufficiently respected that people do go to it as the place to go if you're working in this kind of area. It needs to get to the point where it's unthinkable that it doesn't exist anymore. and then, you've got more chance that it really will be sustainable. I was always dubious, in two minds, about the fact that it's got my name on it. It says David Pearson, Book Owners Online, in the top corner. I was persuaded that, no, yeah, we should do that. We should definitely do that. And I'm not trying not to take responsibility for it and all its failings, but I don't want to own it. I don't want it to be David Pearson's database. I want it to be a database that feels like it belongs to and is developed by whatever the book historical community is. And for that reason, I'm not over proprietorial or over fussed about exactly how every entry is constructed. I don't mind if different entries have different levels of detail, or as long as they follow the basic structure, they're sort of done slightly differently, because I just want it to be whatever is useful to people. And people sometimes say, what are the criteria for entry? And it's vague. And, at the end of the day, anybody who people think it would be desirable to be included in this, they should be included in it. So it's, as I say, I don't want to be proprietorial about it. I want it to be, it's back to the crowdsourcing and the crowd owning and the community owning kind of thing. Because I'm certainly not going to be here forever to develop it. And seriously, I would like it to have a longer life than that. So that's what it is, and where it's at, and why it exists, and what its challenges are. Thank you for coming and listening, and all comments, questions, volunteering effort, anything, very welcome. Thank you again for being here.
Okay, let's, anyone has a question or a comment, or, yes, Tabitha?
Hi, David. I can't see you very well because of the screen share. I don't know if it's possible to undo the screen share.
Yes, I can do that.
Great. Thanks so much, David. I just want to reassure everybody what a fantastic resource this is, and that certainly our students are using it all the time, not just for the historical bibliography module, but also for their research projects. I'm doing a bit of research at the moment in Manchester, and from our point of view in terms of funding, I guess it has to tie in with research, although with my other hat as a librarian on, I absolutely applaud your unnecessarily humble, I would want to say, because it's such a great resource, desire to provide a resource for the future. But I'm doing a bit of research on how we can build in some of this information by joining linked data with MARC, rather than obviously the idea of replacing MARC with linked data, which I think over the last many years has shown itself to be something possibly insurmountable for legacy records. It would be nice to build this in as part of cataloguing practice. Perhaps I don't know if you've got any thoughts about that, so that we can add in references to Book Owners Online as we catalogue, that we can kind of build that into cataloguing training and so on. I don't know what you think about that.
Well, some of the Cambridge College librarians who've been enthusiastic and interested have done a little bit of that kind of work of sort of connecting between their catalogue and the database. And I mean, it's very easy to see how it could be done. I mean, I guess any MARC record which has got a 700 or whatever for one of the owners who's in the database, well, just sort of put the URL in the MARC record, I guess. I mean, is it as easy as that, or put the? I mean, it doesn't sound like rocket science to be able to do that, and I'd be delighted to see that done. And if there was some kind of little systematic project, you know, with a collection in the Rylands or something like that, where you were going to do that, then I think that would be great. It would make a great post on the Facebook page. So, you know, we could tell other people what was going on, and then others might join in. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great idea. Just tell me what I can do to help.
So that would be a standard note, a bit like an ESTC number, but it's a book owner's online number, as it were. And I think that would be absolutely fantastic. So I'll build that into the cataloguing training for the UCL students and for the Manchester students. What we're looking at, though, is trying to integrate linked data into MARC. Now, sounds like a contradiction, so it's a little bit complex. And the result of that is that you get a pop-up on your screen if you hover over that, depending on the way Primo is set, that shows you immediately the other resource. So it's a matter of sort of combining the resources. So we don't just have this sort of flat MARC catalogue record, but if we can find a way of doing that without having to move out of MARC, that would be really interesting. So we're just starting to look at that, and I don't know if anyone from Digital Humanities has got any ideas out there, but certainly I think I'll just start teaching them to do it, and then when they go off as cataloguers, hopefully.
I have a question.
Please.
You were speaking about like difficulties with accessing funding by bodies like the Arts and Humanities Research Council, as an example. Do you think that because your focus is on like having the entries designed by people that they're not kind of standardized, do you feel like you've had to like steer the project in a different direction in order to access funding? Because maybe the Arts and Humanities Research Council would want them more standardized and more kind of routine. I wonder if their priorities don't match your priorities.
I don't think that's an issue as such. I think the priority mismatch is more that sort of you know, academic research output versus creating a reference resource. I think that's the problem with the AHRC. If we put an AHRC project together, the primary output would probably have to be you know, some monograph or some research output around private libraries, and we'd have to sort of sneak the database in as a, you know, we'd have to build this as a resource in order to underpin the main output, but that would be the main output. And you know, the problem is that would be dishonest, actually. I mean, it's not actually what I mean. I've got nothing against academic research outputs coming out of the use of the database, quite the reverse. And I do think that there is scope for some serious work on the history of book ownership more broadly, historically. You know, there's a good monograph to be done there. But my main interest is in building the map, you know, developing the infrastructure. That's what seems to me to be what we most need. And maybe I need to go around a few more houses before I come back and say, oh, well, all right, let's try and knock up some AHRC bid. But you know, they're so competitive and so take so much work. You know, the idea of putting 6 months' work into an AHRC bid that you suspect it's not really going to be their flavour of the month. I don't know, maybe I'm being too pessimistic.
No, I think it's their priorities.
Yeah.
I had a question as well.
Yeah.
Now I understand the database is predominantly focusing on the book owners as opposed to the books themselves.
Yes.
However, as part of your database collection, did you encounter any, say, a fascinating piece of literature that is probably like a first manuscript or an early edition of a particular book. For instance, I saw one of the categories listed was libraries destroyed. So what if that particular library had a certain piece of literature that was lost in history?
Well, I mean, those cases we'll probably never know, you know, what was there. I mean, the ones that get that category are mostly ones that were destroyed during the Civil War in the 17th century, and you know, there are libraries that are known to have disappeared then. I mean, I think you know, I'm sure there's no end of interesting books, or you know, unusual books, or very rare books, whatever, in many of these libraries. And sometimes when an early library did a particularly noteworthy or, you know, well-known manuscript or book that that person is known for, well, yes, that certainly gets mentioned in the entry. We've never tried to incorporate complete lists of people's libraries within the database entries, because that would, you know, madness would lie that way. Got somebody who owned 5,000 books, then I think it would be crazy to try to list every book. We do sometimes put dynamic links to entries in library catalogs, you know, to online library catalogs. But you have to, there's a limit to how far you can go, I think. There's a hand.
Are you?
Yeah, I was interested, moving back to the owners, about the sort of data structures you had for the individuals involved, whether you have any sort of demographic metadata in there of who's related to who, or you know, whether people are just referred to as sort of arbitrary text strings of, you know, names and dates, whether you have a sort of formal modeling of those relationships, and also whether you linked to any, you know, birth, marriage and death records.
We don't generally do that directly from the sort of biographical note bit. Wherever in an entry there's a reference to somebody who's also got an entry in the database themselves, there is a dynamic cross-referencing link. So you know, you can click and easily move between them. The sources section regularly includes online resources which have got more biographical information. So, you know, we often link to History of Parliament pages or wiki pages, or, you know, online sources that immediately give more biographical information. We tend not to link directly to those from the main body of the text, because the biographical note bit that starts the entries is intended very much to be a summary of key points. Most of the people in the database, or certainly all the people who people have heard of, there are places to go for much more robust biographical information, particularly anybody who's in ODNB. So obviously anybody who is in the Dictionary of National Biography, then that entry is in the sources, and there is a, you know, the URL is there. So as long as you've got subscription access to ODNB, you can link directly through that way. I think the simple answer to your question is partly, but not sort of over the toply.
Okay, thanks.
Any final questions or comments? Thank you so much, David.
Thank you. Thank you for
the talk. It was really interesting to hear about this.
Yeah, well, as you know, go away, you know, think about, oh, you know, why doesn't he do ... Drop me an email, you know.
How can we fix stuff?
Yeah.
How can we make an Instagram page for this?
Well, I mean, I mean, ought it to have an Instagram page? I mean, I mean, the Facebook page does get looked at. I mean, it does get a little bit you know, doesn't get a lot of traffic, but you know, if I post something up there, you know, I know that 70 or 100 people or whatever have looked at it, because obviously it tells me that. But as I say, I know that Facebook is now, you know, very uncool. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Should it have an Instagram page? Would that make a big difference to the
To the intros, in the cards.
yeah. You know, if you want to, you know, set one up, I mean, I'd need to train myself to. I don't use Instagram myself. I'm too old.
Even not as much as you.
And I certainly don't use TikTok. You know, I mean, every now and again, somebody says, "Oh, you know, somebody mentioned you on TikTok the other day." Like, great, that's how I like it. You know, that's how. Yeah, I know. I'd rather be talked about than be doing the talk.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks, everyone.